Hi, this is Paul. Glenn Scrivener had Larry Sanger on. Larry Sanger's been making the rounds as he has come out publicly and let everybody know he's a Christian. He's a co-founder of Wikipedia. Obviously, a very smart guy. He's got a PhD in philosophy, and he's telling his story on a bunch of channels now, including a bunch of small channels. And this last bit caught my attention because, of course, it fits in very well with conversations about uh, how people. I would say the epistemic revolution that is currently underway, and it fits in quite a bit with just about everything. So let's listen to a little clip, and then I want to talk a little bit more about this.
If at first the answers seem like nonsense to you, that's okay. Just try to understand them and keep going. And eventually they will actually, I predict, be a lot more compelling. But you don't have to start believing them on faith or something like that. That's not what faith is. This is like the last thought that I'm going to leave you with. This is a great stumbling block of many intelligent Christians or would-be Christians. And that is, the faith that saves is not assent to a proposition. Okay? It is a loyalty to a person. It is trust in God and His Son and the Holy Spirit that indwells you when you are adopted into God's family. So it's very important, I think, that you do all you can to understand things that you might not understand at this point. And bracket your doubts, come to a global comprehension of the Bible in its theological context, and then you might find that a lot of your doubts are not as important. The main thing is to put your trust in God, which is different from being totally convinced on every point of doctrine. It helps to understand doctrine. Don't get me wrong; it's very important. But I put my trust in God before I understood all doctrine. Let's put it
Yes.
that way.
Yes. Yeah.
So to to summarize the story a little bit, he grew up in a church, and then he sort of did what a lot of people did of his generation. He didn't believe it, sort of went out into atheism. He had his training as a philosopher, and decided that a lot of the new atheists just weren't really philosophically coherent, which a lot of philosophers came to that decision about the new atheists. And then at one point he started reading the Bible and really reading it. And at that point he began to put things together. He writes about this, and I'll put the links below, of course. He writes about this in a big document that is entitled How a Skeptical Philosopher Becomes a Christian. He put it on his blog, and he walks right through it. Bethel McGrew did a big piece on this. What I want to focus on as a pastor, what caught my attention was when he wrote about the church. I did not immediately go off to church. I did try going for the first time as a believer since childhood, in maybe May 2020, and the next time I wanted to go, services closed due to COVID. I am sorry to say that I have not yet adopted a church home. So May 2020, that's 5 years ago, almost. I visited 4 local churches, each only a few times, just to see how they work, and visited the websites of literally dozens of other local churches. I have researched denominations quite a bit. While I think I am called to worship with my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ face to face, I am aware that my presence is probably going to be like, well, a bull in a china shop. I am not very careful. And one of his complaints about why he found churches so unhelpful was that he just had so many questions. And again, I don't know that questions are the problem unless the pastor is like, and this guy doesn't seem like totally without social graces, unless the pastor's just trying to say, I can't spend 10 hours a day with you and all your questions, but a reasonable amount of time. And I completely understand that many churches just don't find people asking questions. They get bothered by that because they get frustrated by it. So I had too many questions, and so he says, well, I was not necessarily an easy guy to have in church. For one thing, I still ask too many questions. I'm still probably not as deferential to authority as I should be. And now this is where things get really interesting in this moment, because some people are, I just caught this, Father Barnabas Powell on Twitter just had a nice picture of the catechumens entering the church, and mostly men. There's some women sort of in the back, not all men, but mostly men. And this is what, of course, we've seen and heard. Well, part of what's interesting is that helpful to keep in mind is that the world is very big. And if the numbers that Ready to Harvest gave a number of months ago with respect to orthodoxy, he said something to the effect of, while orthodoxy in America continues to shrink, it's changing, because the shrinkage is because you have large numbers of immigrants who come here as cradle Orthodox, and the longer they're in the States, the parents or their children probably, who are, let's say, baptized in the Orthodox Church, might sort of deconstruct and wander away, whereas now you've got these young men coming in. There are also a group of interesting articles on Substack, people who are anxious about this new flood of converts in terms of how they're going to impact the Orthodox Church. But what Larry Sanger says, I think, which was very true of my experience when the Jordan Peterson thing was happening and people were coming my way and people were trying churches didn't quite know what to do with people. And Jonathan Pajot and James Orr made a comment on that in the conversation that was just released today. I'm still probably not as deferential to authority as I should be. So in other words, there is a small group of determined people who are going to churches that have a lot of tradition of authority because they're looking for that. But I don't know how that's actually going to play out, because long-term deference to authority tends to be built on trust. And that trust tends to have a deep relational component. And part of what's happening in our culture now, by virtue of the bombardment and availability of so many different voices and information sources, that traditional structures of authority are just having a tremendously hard time. There are so many autodidacts out there. There are so many people who have such unlimited access to varying kinds of information that they're sort of piecing their world together. And that's making it incredibly difficult for structures of authority based on propositions to maintain themselves. I still don't want to make a nuisance of myself, and I know myself well enough and how people react to me. I know that I would make a nuisance of myself. Once I figured out my full adherence or reconciled myself to what differences remain to some denomination, I will be less of a nuisance to a congregation. I'm still working out my views on many issues, Lord's Supper, Sola Scriptura, etc., etc. So in other words, he's trying to figure out what he believes from this process of deeply Protestant in the sense of reading the Bible, understanding it within his own terms, understanding it in terms of its coherence philosophically, and trying to say, once I sort of figure out all of my confessional details, then I will look for a church that sort of matches where I am, or is that close enough? But now, of course, he's going to have a difficulty because He might find a church on the internet that seems to match, but there might not be a local church like that by him. Or more than likely, he can find a church that sort of matches all of his different beliefs. But even if he manages to find a local church that ostensibly has all those different beliefs, what he's probably going to find is that that local church is more influenced by the particularities of the last 2 or 3 pastors' beliefs more than the denomination's beliefs. Now, obviously on this channel, I've had a long conversation with confessionality and how that works, and I think this is something that we continue to need to talk about. I remain in a confessional denomination, and the Christian Reformed Church has just had a confessional crisis that it is in the middle of it, because even though confessionality was used to resolve the question of same-sex marriage in the Christian Reformed Church, now what the Christian Reformed Church is dealing with is, because it's sort of put confessionality and the 3 forms of unity up front and emphasized them so much, now there's going to be all kinds of other questions about those documents and other things that are in those documents that don't necessarily pertain to same-sex marriage. And so this struggle in the Christian Reformed Church is going to continue, and that's probably going to be one of the big conversations in Synod 2025. Larry Sanger goes on, I am explaining, not defending my failure to attend church. It's a high priority that I figure out what I need to and get myself to church. I am not saying others should do the same. In other words, waiting until they think they've got things reasonably well figured out. I know that many people continue to study and change their minds on issues for many years, all while attending services of the same church. It's very true. Speaking for myself, I don't want to join a church, basically becoming part of a family, only to feel I must leave after a year or two because I've finally gotten around to thinking hard about some fairly basic issues. And now I see a different denomination is closer to my views. I might feel obliged to do that, and it would be my own fault. Now, part of course, what he's going to have to deal with is, of course, depending a little bit on his temperament and personality, it might not be the case that he just sort of settles and remains in a certain position, sort of like having figured out all of the math and coming to his answers to all the equations, and he sticks to those answers for the rest of his life. Maybe he's that type of person. I don't know. I don't know him personally. And I'm not saying, that's good or bad. But most people, as he observed just right there, part of the reason you go to a church is not to just sort of, here I found my little niche and I want to sit in my little hole and maintain myself and hopefully be validated and vindicated when Jesus comes again, because Jesus says, out of all the confessional denominations, you were right. And there's some tension between what he just said about trust and relating to this highly propositional way that he's going about trying to find the right church. Part of this, and you can use an example of, let's say you're a very analytical person like he clearly is, and then you decide, I want to have a wife, and so I'm going to pick my wife, and so maybe I'll have everybody fill out all of these surveys, and maybe I'll use a dating app or something where people have filled out all these surveys, and I could say, this is exactly the specifications of my wife, and so bang, there she is, and hopefully she will like me, and so then off we go. Well, odds are the wife won't have quite the same approach to the world that he does, won't be quite so analytical, and both of them will continue to grow and change, and as new things come into their life, as they age, as children come along, etc., those things happen. In other words, your primary posture is going to be fundamentally relational rather than abstract propositional analytical. Not only that, I know that my honest frankness, I'd eventually raise questions, and my questions and my very presence, given my background and habits, would be very disruptive unless I've already on board. And I would never want to undermine the pastor in any way, shape, or form on matters of doctrine, particularly if he's simply following his confessional standards or doctrinal statement. And again, all of that is fair, and all of that is generous, and all of that is correctly thinking. But again, despite what he just said, he's approaching church in this deeply analytical way instead of much more primarily in a relational way. He doesn't want to disrupt the confessional postures of all the people around him, but relationally, are those confessional postures just going to hold? Is the Christian faith the kind of thing that all of this stuff sort of stays put? And I would argue that I don't know if that's the best understanding of how all of those things actually function in human beings and communities. For example, I might consider going back to my childhood church, the Lutheran Church, the Missouri Synod, but I'm fairly sure I need to go on disagreeing with them about the meaning of communion. That seems possible. I doubt the meaning of communion need keep me out of the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, but I wouldn't want to start debating the pastor about that. I better make sure I'm on board. And again, the question is, will he stay on board, or will, in fact, part of the reason for being connected to church itself is to have that church mold you and shape you, hopefully in greater conformity to Christ. Now, again, this gets into the question of what exactly is the nature of truth, and to what degree is you have maps that describe the truth. And again, I am a confessional pastor. I believe in confessionality, but I think part of what we are seeing in this epistemic revolution is also a change in terms of understanding where confessionality fits in the stack. That is not to deny confessionality. And this is in many ways what's sort of at the heart of, okay, now that confessionality has been used to resolve the question of same-sex marriage in the Christian Reformed Church. It was very interesting that Reformed Journal, which again had for many years sort of been the landmark journal of the intellectuals in the Christian Reformed Church, all the great names of Calvin College and the Christian Reformed Church wrote for it, just had a piece on the Transfiguration that I alluded to on Sunday. I didn't go into it, but very quickly discussion of the Transfiguration went over sort of to questions of transgenderism. And when I saw this article, I thought, this is exactly the kind of thing that the Abide crew wanted to prevent in the Christian Reformed Church itself. Now, this pastor is a member of the Reformed Church of America, and 30-odd ministers in the Christian Reformed Church in the Grand Rapids area just recently transferred their credentials to the Reformed Church of America. And it's kind of, it makes you kind of wonder what's the Reformed Church of America has had dramatic losses in the last few years, gone from something like 200,000 to 60 or 70,000 members. That many churches and individuals leaving the denomination over these issues. The Christian Reformed, part of the reason the Christian Reformed Church made the decisions it made was to prevent that kind of hollowing out of the denomination. But at the same time, a lot is happening. Ryan Burge, who was a minister, his church closed. He substacks very regularly about church and statistics, has a significant piece about the future of American Christianity is non-denominational. When I read that, I thought, that's, many are saying, the future of American Christianity is orthodoxy. It's a good thing that a lot of Orthodox are thinking about timelines in centuries, not decades, because part of this is what's happening. And then his question is, and I think this has a lot to do with this question of trust, is that people have lost trust in structures. People have lost trust in authorities, authoritative structures. People have lost trust in denominations. One of the things that I had was thinking about as I was just in England, thinking about in England and the Netherlands and Europe. And so in the Netherlands, I stay with Cassidy and Faraday, and they go to like the one Orthodox church there. They have like a sample of one to go to. And then I am over in Germany, and I'm talking to David, who's an Anabaptist minister, and we're talking about Anabaptism. And I was trying to think about a metaphor of how to describe the functions of denominations today, and my mind went to the Appalachian Mountains. Well, why to the Appalachian Mountains? Not because of the cultural groups that are associated with the Appalachian Mountains, but because part of the difference between, let's say, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierras, which are by us here in California, the Sierras are relatively new mountains. And so to drive up to the Sierras, it's not at all difficult to get up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 feet. You've got cascades that are 12, 13, 14,000 feet. We've got some very tall mountains here in the west coast of the United States along the Ring of Fire. The Appalachians, which are over in the east, 4, 5, 6,000 feet. Tallest peaks in the Appalachian Mountains include Mount Mitchell, 6,600 feet. You're just up in the foothills here in Sacramento at that point. Klingman's Dome, 6,600 feet. Mount Guyot, 6,600 feet. And so you've got these mountains that are, compared to, let's say, the Rockies or the Sierras, they're so small because they've just been worn down over time. And in many ways, the denominations are that way. And a lot of what we see are non-denominational churches, which are maybe sort of like the Cascades, which you get these volcanic mountains like Mount Shasta and Mount Baker, and these mountains that seem to come out of nowhere. They're very tall. So a lot of that has been what's happening. We are, now that we're through COVID, I was looking at the deacons. We're sort of moving back in. We've got a Sunday coming where we'll have 3 new adult baptisms, probably 2 new professions of faith. So we'll bring 5 new members into full membership here at Living Stones, which is a good size number for a church our size. And 3 adult baptisms is a really wonderful thing. It's also made me believe that our primary new evangelistic tool is the Freddie and Paul show, because that's what people tend to find, and it grabs their attention, even though just a couple hundred of you watch the Freddie and Paul show. But I basically said to my council, it's probably time, as we have the older guard that was in leadership when I came to this church almost 30 years ago, are now in their 90s. And then there's another layer of leadership that's currently in leadership that's about my age or a little older. Many of these people came into the church within the first 5-6 years of me being here, and they're in leadership now. But now we have to continue to look at, okay, the next level of leadership, but also what this church looks like and how this church goes about its business. And in many ways, because of sort of my unique situation, how this church relates to the internet and relates to estuary. And when I look at Larry Sanger, and when I look at people like him, now again, he's unusual, but part of what I see in working estuary every week is having a space for people with a lot of questions, people who talk about things. Now, part of what happens in a regular estuary group is that it doesn't usually sort of wander off into analytical philosophy. Someone like Larry Sanger is going to be unusual in any church he goes to, but he's been around the rest of us mortal human beings that he clearly knows that already. But part of me is wrestling with, okay, some churches in the Christian Reformed Church are going to basically continue to work the young, restless, and reformed sort of neo-Puritan track. And I think that's a very viable track. Some churches in the Christian Reformed Church are going to work sort of the neo-sacramental track. That's a very viable track. Christ Church Davis, a daughter church of ours that is in Davis, particularly beautiful church, healthy church, doing great work in Davis. Lots of liturgy, lectionary. I mean, people who are curious about Anglicanism, Orthodoxy, Catholicism would feel very at home. If they can be in a Protestant church, they'd feel very at home in that church. For a whole variety of reasons, that's not living stones, at least not now. After, let's say, more years of hopefully surviving and growing, could living stones become more neo-sacramental? Well, perhaps. Liturgically, though, of course, we're in a very different place than, let's say, Christ Church Davis, which is in a space which is much more similar to something like this, where you probably have a lot of people with a lot of brains and good education and reading, and so they're going to go to something that has that has a lot attached to it. Another Substack that was interesting, why don't intellectuals convert to Protestantism? Lack of woo in Protestantism, except, of course, the House of Woo. Secularism, aesthetics and high culture, I think that's a big piece of it. When I think about the two, I think it was Elizabeth Oldfield had said, kind of the two areas of church, no, maybe it was Louise Perry, the two areas of church that seem to be growing are either, they're both sort of pushing against modernity. Either, let's say, neo-sacramental, very high church, very intellectual, or highly Pentecostal. And that those churches tend to have the populist, not so much the intellectuals. I think part of the reason intellectuals are opting for liturgy and high church and sacraments is what Jonathan Peugeot said very early on, where the pastor's just not going to get into trouble when he's surrounded by a church of PhDs or people who could get PhDs if they decided to go that way. Because one thing that sort of the sermon-heavy Protestant approach leads to is all of these confessional matters. But in many other churches where they're not just full of people who have as many, if not more, books than the pastor, well, the dynamics in the church are going to be a little bit different. And so I think we are going to continue to see a big shaking out of churches. And I think we're going to see sort of the landscape that had been sort of rocky peaks and mountains and hills and valleys sort of eroded down into the Appalachians. And the metagelical is going to be a little bit more dominant. But of course, everyone who goes to church and decides they want to go to church as a family and raise their kids, there's going to be negotiation between husband and wife in terms of that. And part of what people are going to face very quickly is that in a church where if dad goes to one church and mom goes to another church, or one of them goes to church and the other doesn't go to church, all of the data says that those kids are probably not going to go to church, or they're going to sort of start picking their own as things go on. In other words, there's going to be negotiation between maybe highly intellectual dad and much more pragmatic mom. And I know, because I hear a bunch of you, when you talk to me about these issues yourself, there's a negotiation and you find a church that you can both live with, probably with compromise. And odds are the wife is going to have a pretty heavy say in it, regardless of what you think in terms of complementarity or egalitarianism. The wife is going to have a pretty heavy say in it because of the role that she plays in the children's lives. So it's a big deal. And I think we're going to continue to see churches, sort of the Appalachian dynamics happen in the church. And we're going to continue to see a lot of upheaval in this space, which again is part of the reason why I think estuary could be, for many churches, a really helpful tool. Because maybe you're smarter than the pastor, and like C.S. Lewis, it gets a little tedious. Maybe you want something that is, let's say, liturgically rock solid, because the liturgy has been for centuries, and you're not going to argue with the liturgy, but maybe you go to a church, you pick a church there, you go to the liturgy, you have the communion. I mean, for a long time I was thinking about, how does this really work with the Roman Catholic Church? Because I don't want to step on anybody's toes here, but to just say that the Roman Catholic Church, and to a certain degree the Orthodox Church, not necessarily known for their homiletics, because their homiletics really isn't front and center. And so what that means is that people go to church for other reasons. And so they go to church for the Mass, or they go to church for the liturgy. Again, Protestants sometimes go to church for the sermon, but some Protestants go to church for the music, and for the expressive music, and for the big box music, and for the psychotechnology of releasing oneself in worship and music. The Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand conversation was so interesting. I'll probably have to talk about that in another video, but because I want to keep this with Appalachians and the church. And maybe I should draw the video to a close here. So let me know what you think.